So recently I've been being invited more often than I ever have to local events, sort of underground movements of folks who have to kind of keep it on the down low because they're university affiliation or various groups where they don't want to let their employers know that they're against all of these interventions. They're against vaccine mandates. They're against masks in the workplace. And they have to kind of keep it quiet. And I've been invited to a couple of these events which feel like it's sort of an underground revolutionary movements. And recently I went to a Moms for Liberty, a new one that opened up in Franklin County here in Ohio. And you know, they're motivated less by lockdowns, but in terms of shutting down the schools and having them done by Zoom, issues like mandates for the students, issues in school. And so here you've got these just regular folks. They're not scientists, they're not politicians, they're not folks that are used to being in front of crowds and presenting data. And it's incumbent upon them to get their kids to get the masks off and to have a normal life in school, and without having to take an emergency approved, which has little or no value for someone that has already a 10 times lower risk than. It's incumbent upon them to prove to the school boards, in a very short 2-minute, whatever they're given in these sorts of meetings, they have to provide evidence that these different kinds of interventions have harm. Now, why should it be incumbent upon them to show that emergency approved for a disease that has almost no risk to their children, that covering the the only 2 breathing holds of their children for 8 hours a day, as well as their identities and their ability to emotionally express, and as well as their lower visual field, and getting kinds of acne and potentially oxygenation issues. Why should it be incumbent upon the parents to provide in such a short period of time evidence that these things are unsafe? Now, there's something called the precautionary principle that we've hinted at in various earlier videos. Now, the wrong intuition about the precautionary principle, if you just said the word, you might say, oh, well, it's about just taking precautions for some kind of risk that hits us in society. In this case, the risk for us was dangerous pandemic. No, that's not what the precautionary principle is about. The precautionary principle is a kind of general rule of thumb for how to move forward in society with policy. And the problem is, what it implicitly recognizes and is trying to account for, is the fact that when humans engage in new kinds of policies, even seemingly small ones, they often upset some kind of equilibrium that we've found, even though no one may be consciously aware of it, that we've found. You upset that, and there's then great impacts to society, that either economic impacts or health impacts or even death and life and death impacts. The precautionary principle says that that the burden of evidence is on those who are proposing the new interventions. The burden of evidence is on them to show that these interventions are both effective and safe. The burden of evidence isn't on these Moms for Liberty to show up in their 2 minutes and show that they're not safe. The burden of evidence is on the school boards to show that locking down the schools for 6 months or a year and sending kids home, and all of the impacts, all of the varieties of impacts, are safe and healthy and lead to the similar kinds of educational capabilities without the kinds of downs. It's incumbent upon them. They're the ones who have to find the scientists. And what the parents should, if they do anything, can go in there and just poke holes in their arguments, because the burden is on the school board. If the school board suggests, hey, we're going to mask your children, like they did to prisoners in Guantanamo Bay, and put these things on terrorists who are going to prison, and the whole world reacted and said, oh my God, this is torture. If your proposal is to put those on your children for 8 hours a day, it is incumbent upon you to provide evidence that these are deeply effective and have no downsides. It's not incumbent upon the Moms for Liberty to show up and in 2 minutes provide arguments, and with real evidence over many years, the kinds of things that you'd have to show, that here's the empirical evidence that shows that there's these deficits, and here's the control cases. So no, it's not incumbent upon them, it's incumbent on you. And for mandates on these kids for a disease that's 10 to 15 times safer, COVID is 10 to 15 times safer than these age groups, Why would it be something that is mandated upon them to take an emergency approved, even if it works? We're talking about starting with the risks, even if you get it. And of course, they may not get it, but even if you get it, it's like 0.0001%. These are micro things, 10 times lower. Why would it be mandated, even if vaccines were 100% effective without any risks? These are such micro risks that are involved. There's no reason to mandate these things. And of course, there are risks involved. There are risks involved for every student because there's just actual risks. These are emergency proof. They have no long-term data. And two, for children that have already had COVID, many of them have, there's even greater risks. And there's no reward because you already have natural immunity. Why is it incumbent upon these parents to come in and make this kind of case? This is not their job. This is not their specialty. They're not orators. They're not scientists. They're not politicians. They're not public health people. The burden of evidence is on the politicians and on the board members to do this. The entire argument has been upside down for the last year and a half. We shouldn't have to argue anything. Our job is to just poke holes in the arguments that you have for these draconian policies at all levels. But instead, we've been pushed back and having to say, no, these are harmful, these are harmful, these are harmful. No, you show us they're safe. From now on, I would recommend you walk in with the attitude, no, you show us that they're safe, because prima facie, that is, at first glance, covering my children's face, mouth and nose all day long is obviously not safe, for God's sakes. Sending my kid home for a year is not safe for their education and for their development. Giving them an emergency approved vaccine for something that's a vanishing risk to them is not safe. You provide the evidence. Otherwise, shut up until you get that kind of evidence. We have to turn this upside down and change the entire argument. And we have to make sure that next time this happens, and it will happen, if we can get past this is going to happen for our children's generation or their children's generation. The burden of evidence is on the politicians and those that want to make these new kinds of interventions. It is never on us. There's still baton twirlers, sort of COVID authoritarians, who are still going around attacking those that are on Team Reality and accusing us of having violated the precautionary principle by pushing back on the interventions, the draconian interventions, which have all been shown to have been completely ineffective and radically, dramatically harmful worldwide. But they still are flipping the precautionary principle upside down. So I just want you to remind you what the precautionary principle first sounds like. It sounds like, to certain laymen and otherwise intelligent seeming people, they go, oh, the precautionary principle means that if there's a potential danger, you should take precautions. Well, do you really think that you need some sophisticated principle to set that into stone, that you should, do safeguard to protect yourself? No, the whole point for why there's a principle called the precautionary principle is not to say, hey, let's just be safe when there's something that's at risk. No, the entire point is that there's another kind of risk that we're more blind to as humans, and that is that when we are trying to protect ourselves against something obvious that's potentially attacking us or causing harms, the biggest danger is often ourselves. The precautionary principle is about how to protect ourselves from ourselves, because that's often where we're blind and how we actually, in fact, typically harm ourselves. The greatest harms that occur to society are typically self-induced, either on purpose or by accident. The point of the precautionary principle is that the burden of evidence is on those presenting new, untested policies to show that they work and that they have sufficiently low side effects and harms that it's worth doing. The problem is that it's very unclear when there are new policies put forth what those consequences will be, because it's really very hard for any kind of scientist, no matter how smart, or any group, to figure out what those consequences are, because there's often society-wide and still ongoing and tumbling dominoes that happen for years and years later. And often they're undoing processes, equilibrium solutions that have occurred through no designer at all. Just cultural selection has evolved and found these solutions, and you're upsetting it when you do these sorts of new interventions. So again, a nice way to think about the precautionary principle is it's not about precautions against dangers that are coming from the outside. The entire point is that it's protecting us
from ourselves. I'm going to go through my Substack where I discuss the introduction of the culpability principle in, again, context of its cousin at the other side of the coin of the precautionary principle. But I want to just walk through the precautionary principle first in the process of getting to the culpability principle so we can understand it. So let me just go ahead and usually I just talk. I'm going to go ahead and read from this, and I'll pop up some imagery as needed as I go along. So you've heard of the precautionary principle, but we desperately need a new principle, one I will describe now. It's called the intervention culpability principle. And in fact, I'm going to suggest that we call the precautionary principle the intervention precautionary principle to make it less ambiguous, as I'll discuss now. So the precautionary principle, let's make sure we understand that first. The precautionary principle is not that we should take precautions when there are perceived dangers. And I've talked about this a couple times and hinted at it in a number of Science Moment videos. Unfortunately, this is almost the exact opposite of what the precautionary principle actually says. And so I'm linking moment number 113, which was banned from YouTube, where I introduced the precautionary principle, the real meaning of the precautionary principle, and then another one that didn't get taken down, and I don't know the number of it right now, but I'll pop it up on the screen here. So what does the precautionary principle actually say? Well, so it doesn't say, hey, let's take precautions when there's dangers. We don't need a principle that says that. We naturally do that. Where we need a principle is for us to do something a little bit counterintuitive, something that we wouldn't obviously otherwise think of. And the precautionary principle is this, or the intervention precautionary principle is this. It says that the burden of evidence is on those proposing the novel interventions to show that they will work and will have low harms. That is, this is a burden of evidence kind of principle. It's not about specifically what to do, but it's saying the burden of evidence is on you. You're the one who's proposing these new interventions. It's your responsibility to show that they're going to work and have few harms, right? The point being that the greatest risk to us in society is always the rushed interventions that humans do to help us. Because there's all of these ways they can go wrong, and we are very bad at seeing how they go wrong. Cost-benefit analyses are incredibly difficult to do, especially when you don't know the cascading domino effects that could occur. And often when we're doing these interventions, we're rushed and panicked and want to do something quickly to help. And so we're even less able to see that there's all of these possible side effects. So the precautionary principle, the intervention precautionary principle, sort of puts this down in stone and says, no, you just can't even move forward on these restrictions, on these interventions, on these civil liberties violating things until you, not us, you show that they work and have sufficiently few harms. All right, that's the precautionary principle. So I'm repeating in some sense what I actually write here because I tend to just talk. So what's the justification? Just to cover it one more time in a different way. What's the justification for the precautionary principle? It is that society culturally evolves over time into somewhat optimal spots with no designer behind it. When we make perturbations, it almost always shifts things to some current local optimum to something less optimal. Right? Over time, we've culturally evolved. We find ourselves into pretty good spots. Random perturbations in different directions usually are going to be much worse. That's why it has to be extremely well thought through, lest you end up with famine. And some of the worst things that have ever happened are due to our own, often helpful, interventions. And so there's a long history of our human interventions wrecking things. The greatest historical democides, that is mass deaths by governments, are usually due to the results of society's well-intentioned policies. So that's the what and the why of the precautionary principle. But I said we need another principle. What's that? Well, whereas the precautionary principle concerns how to behave before initiating novel interventions, this new principle concerns how to behave after having implemented the novel interventions. The baseline assumption in the mainstream COVID narrative is that the interventions worked. They slowed the spread, they saved hospitals, any costs were small relative to this, and they were certainly not the cause of most of the supposed COVID deaths that the interventions were protecting us from. Right? That's the baseline assumption, is that the interventions, well, they did all of those things, right? And certainly not the cause of all of these excess deaths that occurred, for example, in March and April of 2020. It's been the skeptics and the narrative outsiders, the dissidents, that have been having to provide evidence, mostly ignored, that the interventions in fact did not slow the spread, did not save hospitals, had devastating harms, and are quite probably the principal cause of most of the supposed COVID deaths that the interventions were supposedly protecting us from. That is to say, in the post-intervention situation we're now in, the burden has been on those skeptical of the interventions to demonstrate the failure of the interventions. Why is that? This has things backwards. Why isn't the burden on those that supported the draconian, civil liberties violating interventions to demonstrate that the interventions were in fact successful? The wisdom of the precautionary principle is that in the absence of very good arguments, we presume that society's current functioning has found some local optimum. That is, it's pretty good, it's not global optimum. Most deviations from that will lower the utility, and often astronomically so. And this is in the best of circumstances, where everybody's well-intentioned. Of course, it's very often not that. It's even more relevant when interventions are implemented quickly, when civil liberties are violated, or when they're implemented under a perceived pressure to do something to save us. But those very reasons justifying the precautionary principle also argue that the post-intervention presumption should be that the interventions failed. The presumption should definitely not be that the interventions worked as planned. They rarely do work as planned. And those in power that implemented the interventions are exactly the folks you cannot trust when they claim they worked as planned. Again, no matter how well-intentioned they might be. This is especially the case for interventions that were not implemented with an eye for the precautionary principle in the first place, as was the case for the COVID interventions, where one was a denier to even suggest that cost-benefit analyses must be done. So just as the precautionary principle puts the burden on the interventionists before their implementation, this new principle puts the burden on the interventionists after the interventions have been implemented. And here's the new principle: the culpability principle, or the intervention culpability principle. The burden is on those supporting the novel interventions to show they worked as advertised. It is the interventionists' responsibility to fully and independently audit the consequences of the interventions against the starting assumption that they did not work and that they did have significant harms. I'm not saying that we trust them to audit it. It has to be truly independent. But it's their responsibility to make sure that it's been done, and our responsibility to make sure that they've done it, truly independently. And the culpability principle is even more relevant for interventions that never took the precautionary principle seriously, were implemented in haste, were implemented in fear, were implemented with righteous justification, were perceived as common sense, and those that violated civil liberties. For COVID, the culpability principle says the burden is on the lockdowners, the maskers, the supporters of mandatory vaccinations, etc., to show that the interventions slowed the spread. The interventions saved hospitals. Any costs were small relative to the benefits. The interventions were certainly not the cause of most of the supposed COVID deaths that the interventions were protecting us from. They need to show that, rather than us having to show that it happened. No, the presumption is it happened. You show that it didn't happen. Because we know that when you make these sorts of untested rush interventions, that's usually what happens: harms. The precautionary and culpability principles comprise the wisdom that our greatest threats come from our own actions. They're just the pre- and post-game versions of the same core principle. Precautionary principle: the burden is on you to convince me 12 ways to Sunday that your ingenious scheme to save us isn't going to royally fuck things up. And the culpability principle is the burden is on you to convince me 12 ways to Sunday that your ingenious scheme to save us didn't royally fuck things up. But, some might reply, once the interventions have actually occurred, won't it be obvious whether the interventions worked as advertised? Not at all. Not even supposing everyone is acting as independent and objective scientists. And especially not in a climate where a mainstream narrative will inevitably have formed post hoc justifying the wisdom and ethics of the interventions. Which is what's always going to happen. When they push this many chips on the table, so to speak, and violate civil liberties en masse and engage in these kinds of righteous, save the world behaviors, narratives are going to pop up, even if nobody's purposely doing it, that justify every damn thing that they did. That is the baseline presumption of what will happen, even when there are massive harms and no help. Both principles are also related to the Hippocratic Oath, to do no harm, except that the concern here is where the burden of evidence lies for those doing novel interventions. In doctor terms, the precautionary principle says, that is, if you were to say the precautionary principle in terms of what a single doctor might be doing, the burden is on the doctor to convince us that the novel medical intervention isn't quack medicine or worse before it's administered. Right? Convince us this is not quack, this is new, you better convince us this is real, right? And there's no harms and it really works. The culpability principle says, in doctor terms, in Hippocratic Oath kind of terms, is the burden is on the doctor to convince us that any harms coming after the novel medical intervention are not due to the failure of the intervention. Right? And that's obvious. If you find that someone did quack medicine on your grandma, you say, hey, she's been having this limp or this or that afterwards, low blood sugar, whatever it might be, you have to convince us that you're not responsible. Right? The burden is not on me to show that it was your responsibility. The presumption is that it was you. Right? And you need to convince us otherwise. Burden of proof principles are crucial here, and they're fundamentally different from what people think the precautionary principle is about. Finally, as an addendum, and I hinted at this earlier, because the precautionary principle is commonly misunderstood to dangerously mean the opposite. We must all take precautions. Right, which is what they think it means. As I joke, we don't need a principle for that, right? It would greatly help to rename these two principles as follows: the intervention precautionary principle and the intervention culpability principle. These concern the burden of evidence on those proposing the novel interventions.